I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker. As I mentioned at the top of the program, Representative Dade Phelan cannot be here because of the flooding in Southeast Texas, and we're thinking about folks in Southeast Texas as well. But as I mentioned earlier as well, Senator Kirk Watson has graciously agreed to step in. Senator Watson is former mayor of Austin. Many of us that live in Austin know that very well. And he was first elected to the Texas Senate in 2006. He's been reelected 4 times. He represents most of Travis County and the entirety of Bastrop County. In 2019, his colleagues in the Texas Senate elected Senator Watson President pro tem for the 86th legislature. He was also vice chairman of the Senate Nominations Committee, serves on committees overseeing broad areas that affect all Texans, including education, finance, and higher education. He's on the Sunset Advisory Commission and on the Senate Select Committee on Redistricting. Senator Watson makes the effective case for open government and for transparency, and he also is able to secure passage of meaningful reforms and of legislation that affect open government and transparency. It's an honor to introduce him. Please help me welcome Senator Watson.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to get to be here, although I can see the disappointment on so many people's faces because I ain't Dade. But he's a good friend, and we do hold all of the people of Southeast Texas right now in our thoughts and prayers. And if you've followed what's going on, his district specifically has really taken a beating. So I'm happy to fill in on his behalf, although I can't fill his shoes. I will tell you that we've got to work very closely together on legislation related to open government during this past session when the Court of Criminal Appeals declared the open meetings law to be unconstitutionally vague. And regardless of whether you agree with that opinion, it put us in a tailspin because they did it literally about a week before the filing deadline where you had to file bills in order for them to be heard during the legislative session. And it was Chairman Phelan that shepherded that through the House. I was happy to carry it over on the Senate side, and we would not have been able to pass that legislation but for his good work. So I want to say thank you. And it is true that I just got this gig yesterday, so the good news is I won't be filibustering here today. But I'll tell you, I'm happy any chance I get to help the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, including when they're in a pinch, because as you've already heard a little bit, if you've been here this morning, and even as I recognized and introduced the winners of the James Madison Award, I feel like I've been through a lot with the Freedom of Information Foundation over the past several years, and together we've made, I think, some very real progress toward governmental transparency. But as you've also heard, particularly through this morning, we still have work to do. I'll tell you that transparency in government has been very important to me, I would say ever since I began my adventure in public service, but really even before that, before I was in elective office. To me, transparency is absolutely critical for at least 2 reasons. First, prevention. Now, I'm not overly cynical. I truly believe that most folks who enter public service, either as an elected official, an appointed official, or as professional career employees and therefore public servants, I believe those people do so because they want to do good. They want to help our communities, to help our state. But the simple truth is, even as I feel strongly that way, I worry less about public servants screwing up, either due to negligence or bad intent, if they know that the people are watching. It's been said many, many times. In fact, it's trite. But it's trite because it's true. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. The second reason I feel so strongly is accountability. We must never forget that anyone working in government is there to serve the people. They are our client. They are our boss. They are whatever is the politically correct term to describe who we're working for. If the people don't know what government actors are doing on the public's behalf, then the people can't hold them accountable. I said it this morning in answer to a question when I was on a panel this morning. Elections matter. But people need information in order to make them truly matter. And in that way, transparency is essential to our representative government. Now, the legislators who wrote the Public Information Act certainly knew about transparency and accountability. They were coming off the Sharpstown fraud scandal that resulted in about half of the legislature leaving or being voted out of office. Those that came back, or that came for the first time in 1973, they did so with a mandate from those people, from the election mattered in that case. The mandate was to clean up the Texas Capitol and to restore the public's trust. They answered the call by passing the initial version of the Public Information Act. And they had some additional transparency measures, things that were related to open meetings, lobby regulations, and financial disclosure statements. But I want to focus on the Public Information Act because those members made their intent clear. The first section of the Public Information Act is often quoted, as it should be. I actually think it's the perfect North Star on the issue, and you will rarely hear me say, I think legislative language is perfect. But here's what it says. Listen to this. Under the fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of representative government that adheres to the principle that government is the servant and not the master of the people, it is the policy of this state that each person is entitled, unless otherwise expressly provided by law, at all times to complete information about the affairs of government and the official acts of public officials and employees. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. The provisions of this chapter shall be liberally construed to implement this policy. You applauded for it, so let's say it one more time. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. In other words, transparency is critical to prevention and accountability. Of course, scandals didn't stop with Sharpstown. And for many years, we've heard a lot of talk about transparency and ethics, but we haven't seen much action. Last session, we saw a shift. We saw real and meaningful improvements in the transparency field, but some would argue that those real and meaningful improvements were improvements on a system that had fallen into disrepair. You've heard about many of the improvements already during this morning's panels. I was proud, as I've already pointed out, to lead the effort with Representative Capriglione on the Public Information Act reforms. We've talked a little bit about this at this lunch because we've recognized the people that were crucial to it, some of the people that were. But what we did is we restored much needed transparency around public-private contracts, and we closed what was known as the custodian loophole, which previously made it difficult to get public information off of a government official's private device or account. As has been noted, this was a multi-year, 100-plus stakeholder list effort, and I'm very grateful to all of the advocates, including the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, the Texas Attorney General's Office, Kelsey and Katie, all of the folks that made this progress possible. As I've also noted, I worked with Chairman Phelan, and I know he wanted to be here today, but we worked together to ensure that that giant hole that got blown in the Open Meetings Act was repaired. Our bill, which was Senate Bill 1640, ensures that government officials can't avoid open meeting requirements by meeting in a series of small, private meetings to avoid a quorum. You've heard some names here today. Capriglione, Hunter, Speaker Pro Tem Moody, who was just honored by winning that award, State Representative Rodriguez, Senator Nathan Johnson. They all did important work on these topics too, which brings me to the point that deserves to be underlined. There's much more we need to accomplish together. In the first panel this morning, you heard Chairman Hunter talk about the bill to restore access to dates of birth information, which is important for a variety of reasons relating to commerce, criminal justice, and even campaign reporting. We need to get that one passed. In the second panel, you heard about Speaker Pro Tem Moody's valiant efforts to shine a light on the tragic circumstances when someone dies in police custody. We have to improve transparency and accountability on this issue, which is literally life or death. I would also add that we have to pass something like what Representative Rodriguez and Senator Johnson worked on last session to improve the public's access to electronic information and data. The excellent, the great, but heartbreaking reporting that the Dallas Morning News did in its Pain and Profit series is the example that always comes to my mind when I think about this topic. I don't think that work, as good as it was, and as painful as it was, would have been possible if the reporters hadn't had access to the data. And I'll tell you, it's my understanding that they had to use other states' public information laws to get some of that data. Well, that ought to concern all of us, because whether it be Medicaid, education spending, disaster response, environmental issues, or economic development, none of us will truly know what's going on if we don't see the data and if reporters can't see the data. So while we made huge strides this past session, and I've actually thrown my shoulder out a couple of times, patting myself on the back, there is much more work that needs to be done. And frankly, I think it's as important, if not more important than ever, because we have some really critical decisions coming our way. Next session is a redistricting session. The lines that get drawn in 2021 will have huge implications for our growing and diverse state, and big implications for our most fundamental rights. Elections matter. The repercussions will be felt by every Texan for a decade or more. What we do in the next session with regard to redistricting will be felt for at least a decade or more. It's a complicated, it's a difficult process, and it is one that desperately needs sunshine. But first up is the census, which will be the basis for all of the maps that get drawn. Again, that will have huge implications for our state for years to come. Misinformation and fear has been the narrative of this census so far. Probably the opposite of transparency. There's still time for us to change that, and we ought to change that story. But it's going to take getting to a lot more information, getting it out into the public before we can do that. If we as a nation are the sum of our parts, it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that every part of our nation is counted. That means paying close attention to what measures are and are not being taken in ensuring an accurate count is conducted. It means not letting misinformation permeate so that someone doesn't participate for one reason or another. It means everyone involved in the process should be making sure that this process is transparent, and they should be transparent about not only what they are doing, but why they're doing it. We've all seen how the game can be rigged so that those with a certain viewpoint have an outsized influence and the ability to drown out anyone who disagrees with them. That's why there is no greater space where transparency and accountability must take an active role. Our democracy depends on it. This issue is one in which the people must insist on remaining informed. And I think the people in this room all play an enormous role in helping them understand what's really at stake. The public has to be informed, knowledgeable, engaged, and really heard if we believe the people should pick their representatives and not the other way around. Remember, the people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. That applies in no greater place than redistricting. Ultimately, I think we can all agree that the state of Texas has not been a model of transparency in previous redistricting rounds. So I hope you will join with me to demand more, to demand that we do better this time around. It's beyond time for us to stop having hearings where there ain't nobody hearing nothing. It is time for us to make this process as publicly as is humanly possible with regard to data, with regard to process, with regard to how we're going to do it, what we're doing, and why. And I call on all of you to help with that, because we're not off to a very promising start. We're not off to a promising start if the easy passage of House Bill 4181 in the last session is any indication. That bill, which blew through the House without even a committee hearing, so there really ain't nobody hearing nothing, that bill greatly expanded the ability of the legislature to withhold its own internal communications through legislative privilege and other shields. There was no real debate, and only a handful of us voted against the bill. If you recall, during the last round of redistricting, the court relied upon a series of internal emails that proved the legislature's discriminatory intent in drawing the maps. Well, I'll tell you, I worry greatly. The intent of HB 4181 is to avoid that same damning mistake by shielding it under a giant umbrella of legislative privilege. The legislature needs to be held accountable as it deals with the decisions that strike at the heart of our representative democracy. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. Let's call for the openness. Let's call for the legislature not paying lip service. Let's call for new ways that we hear one another and we do redistricting. Gun violence, mass shootings are another topic where transparency and accountability are at the forefront like never before. People are beyond frustrated with the status quo. And yet, it often feels like those in control of the Capitol are simply waiting for the news cycle to pass from the most recent shooting, waiting for it to end so that they can avoid taking action yet again. We've also seen the increased use of closed-door, invitation-only roundtables to address the issue, instead of public hearings with witnesses and the media present. Folks, this should raise concerns at the very least. After the second mass shooting in Texas within a month, the leadership finally at least agreed to create legislative committees that ostensibly will have public hearings across the state. I'll tell you, I'd prefer a special session that allows the whole legislature to weigh in on the issue, to talk about it, to have the kind of open public discussion this deserves, because it affects all of our constituents. But a series of public hearings is a significant improvement over where things stood before. But hearings are not results. They're not even close. So again, transparency and accountability will continue to be important. The people need to know what their representatives are doing or not doing on these issues to again address what is another life or death issue. These are just a few of the upcoming issues that highlight why our crusade, and when I say our, I mean all of us, our crusade for greater transparency simply has to continue. We made very real progress this past session. And we did it in no small part because of the people in this room and others that helped make it a priority and gave it the attention that it deserves. We have to keep that up. We have to keep that up, if not double down, because the decisions being made over the next couple of years are going to profoundly impact every Texan for years to come. You may not live in Senate District 14. You may not have the good fortune. But when it comes to government transparency, whether you live in Senate District 14 or not, I'm your senator. And if you can't tell, I like being your senator. I want to thank you all again for having me. I want to thank the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas for the great work that it does, for the support that it provides, and for the role it plays in making sure the insistence of the people is recognized. So thank you again for having me, and thank you again for your ongoing commitment to transparency. God bless all of you. Thank you.